Richard Harrington had more money than most people could dream of. His tech company was worth billions. He owned a mansion so big that you could get lost in it. He had cars that cost more than houses, watches that cost more than cars, and a private jet that could take him anywhere in the world within hours. But none of it made him happy. Not anymore. 3 years ago, Richard lost his wife to cancer. She fought hard for 2 years, but in the end, the disease was stronger. When she died, something inside Richard died too. He stopped smiling. He stopped laughing. He buried himself in work because work was the only thing that didn't remind him of her. Well, almost the only thing. There was also Ethan, his 8-year-old son. Ethan was born with cerebral palsy. He couldn't walk. He couldn't feed himself. He needed help with almost everything. But his mind was sharp, and his eyes were full of life. When his mother was alive, she made sure Ethan knew he was loved every single day. She would read to him for hours. She would sing to him. She would hold his hand and tell him stories about all the adventures they would have together. But now she was gone. And Richard didn't know how to fill that gap. It wasn't that Richard didn't love his son. He did, more than anything. But every time he looked at Ethan, he saw his wife's eyes looking back at him. He saw her smile and the boy's smile. And it hurt so much that Richard found it easier to just stay away. So he hired the best nurses money could buy. He hired therapists and specialists and caregivers. He made sure Ethan had everything he needed. Everything except the one thing that mattered most, his father's presence. Richard told himself it was temporary. He told himself that once the pain got easier, he would be there for Ethan. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. And before Richard knew it, he had become a stranger in his own son's life. The mansion was always full of staff. Cooks, cleaners, gardeners, drivers. They moved through the house like ghosts, doing their jobs quietly and efficiently. Richard barely noticed them. To him, they were just part of the machinery that kept his life running smoothly. One of those staff members was a woman named Maria Santos. Maria had been Richard's housekeeper for 2 years. She was in her late 30s, with tired eyes and hands that were rough from years of hard work. She never complained. She never asked for anything extra. She just did her job and did it well. Maria was a single mother. Her husband had left when her daughter was just 3 years old, and she had been raising the girl on her own ever since. It wasn't easy. Money was always tight. But Maria was determined to give her daughter a better life than she had. Her daughter's name was Sophia. She was 12 years old, with long dark hair and curious brown eyes. Sophia was the kind of girl who noticed things. She noticed when someone was sad. She noticed when someone was lonely. She noticed the small details that other people missed. During school breaks, Maria had no choice but to bring Sophia to work with her. She couldn't afford childcare, and she didn't have any family nearby who could help. So Sophia would come to the mansion and sit in the corner of the kitchen, doing her homework or reading a book. Nobody paid attention to her. She was invisible. Just another part of the background. Richard had seen Sophia a few times, but he never really looked at her. She was just the maid's daughter. She wasn't his concern, but that was about to change. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The rain was coming down hard, drumming against the windows like 1,000 tiny fingers. Richard had come home early from a business trip. His meetings had been canceled due to the weather, and for once, he had nowhere else to be. The house was strangely quiet when he walked through the front door. Usually, he could hear the sound of the television from Ethan's room, or the voice of his nurse talking on the phone. But today, there was nothing. Richard frowned and walked through the hallway, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Where was everyone? Where was Ethan's nurse? He was about to call out when he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. Laughter. It was coming from the sunroom at the back of the house. Richard walked toward the sound, his heart beating a little faster. He knew that laugh. It was Ethan's laugh, but he hadn't heard it in so long that for a moment he almost didn't recognize it. He reached the doorway of the sunroom and looked inside. What he saw made him freeze. There was Sophia, the maid's daughter, sitting on the floor next to Ethan's wheelchair. She had a plate of fruit in her lap, cut into small pieces, and she was feeding Ethan, one piece at a time, making silly faces and sound effects with each bite. "Okay, this one is a super rocket," Sophia said, holding up a piece of strawberry. "It's going all the way to Mars. Ready? 3, 2, 1, blast off." She made a whooshing sound and flew the strawberry through the air before popping it gently into Ethan's mouth. The boy giggled and chewed happily, his eyes bright with joy. Richard stood there, unable to move. He watched as Sophia picked up another piece of fruit. "And this one is a penguin," she said seriously. "Penguins are very good swimmers, you know. But this penguin is hungry and needs to go home. Can you help him find his home?" Ethan nodded eagerly, and Sophia guided the fruit toward his mouth with exaggerated slowness, making penguin sounds along the way. When Ethan finally ate, Sophia clapped her hands and cheered. "You saved the penguin! You're a hero!" Ethan laughed again, and the sound filled the room like sunshine, breaking through clouds. Richard felt something crack inside his chest. He realized, with a painful clarity, that he couldn't remember the last time he had made his son laugh like that. The nurses fed Ethan efficiently, but there was no warmth in it. No joy. There was just a task to be completed. But this 12-year-old girl who had nothing, was treating his son like he was the most special person in the world. He stepped back from the doorway, not wanting to be seen. He needed to understand what was happening. He needed to know how long this had been going on. Richard found Maria in the laundry room, folding sheets with shaking hands. When she saw him standing in the doorway, her face went pale. "Mr. Harrington," she said quickly, "I can explain. The day nurse called in sick this morning, and the backup never arrived. I tried calling the agency, but they said it would take at least 2 hours. I didn't know what to do. I had to keep working, and Sophia, she just went to check on Ethan, and how long?" Richard interrupted. Maria blinked. "How long what, sir? How long has your daughter been spending time with my son?" Maria looked down at her hands. She was sure she was about to be fired. After 2 years of perfect work, she was going to lose her job because of this. "A few months," she admitted quietly. Sophia started going to his room during her lunch breaks. She reads to him. She talks to him. She says he's her best friend. Maria looked up, tears forming in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Harrington. I should have told you. If you want me to leave, I understand. That won't be necessary," Richard said, and without another word, he turned and walked away. Maria stood there alone, her heart pounding. She didn't know what was going to happen next. All she knew was that everything was about to change. She just didn't know how much. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He lay in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene in his mind over and over again. The little girl sitting on the floor, the plate of fruit, the silly voices, and his son's laughter ringing out like a bell that had been silent for too long. Who was this girl? Why did she care so much about a boy she had no connection to? Most adults didn't even look at Ethan properly. They would glance at his wheelchair and quickly look away, uncomfortable and unsure of what to say. But this 12-year-old had sat with him like it was the most natural thing in the world. Richard got out of bed and walked to the window. The rain had stopped, and the moon was casting silver light across the gardens below. Somewhere in this house, his son was sleeping. And somewhere in a tiny apartment across town, the maid's daughter was probably sleeping too. He thought about what Maria had said. Sophia reads to him. She talks to him. She says he's her best friend. His best friend. Richard pressed his forehead against the cold glass. When was the last time Ethan had a friend? The nurses were paid to take care of him. The therapists were paid to work with him. Everyone in Ethan's life was there because it was their job. But Sophia wasn't getting paid. She wasn't doing it for money or recognition. She was doing it simply because she wanted to. The next morning, Richard did something he hadn't done in a very long time. Instead of leaving for work at 6 in the morning, he stayed home. He told his assistant to cancel his meetings. He told his driver he wouldn't need the car. And then he waited. Maria arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, just like she did every day. Sophia was with her, carrying a worn backpack and a library book. Richard watched from the upstairs window as they walked up the driveway. Sophia was saying something to her mother, gesturing with her hands, and Maria was nodding and smiling. They looked happy. Despite everything they didn't have, they looked genuinely happy. Richard spent the morning in his study, pretending to work. But really, he was listening. He heard Maria vacuuming the hallway. He heard the cook preparing lunch in the kitchen. And around noon, he heard something else. Footsteps. Small, quiet footsteps heading toward Ethan's room. Richard got up from his desk and moved silently down the corridor. He stopped outside Ethan's door, which was slightly open, and listened. Okay, so yesterday, we stopped at the part where the dragon was about to attack the village, Sophia's voice said. Do you remember what the brave knight did? Richard heard Ethan make a sound. It wasn't words exactly, but it was clearly an answer of some kind. That's right, Sophia said excitedly. He didn't fight the dragon. He talked to the dragon. Because sometimes, the scariest things just need someone to understand them. Ready for the next part? Richard peered through the gap in the door. Sophia was sitting in a chair next to Ethan's bed, holding a thick book with a dragon on the cover. Ethan was propped up against his pillows, his eyes fixed on Sophia with complete attention. She began to read, her voice rising and falling with the story. When there was action, she read fast and loud. When there was danger, she whispered. When there was something funny, she paused and looked at Ethan, waiting for his reaction, and Ethan reacted. Every single time. He smiled. He made sounds. His eyes went wide. He was completely engaged in the story. Richard stepped back from the door, his heart heavy. The nurses never read to Ethan like that. They would put on audiobooks or turn on the television. They would give him his medication and make sure he was comfortable. But they didn't sit with him. They didn't make the stories come alive. They didn't treat him like a boy who loved adventures and dragons and brave knights. Sophia did. For the next 3 days, Richard stayed home and watched. He didn't let anyone know what he was doing. He just observed quietly from a distance. He saw Sophia visit Ethan during her lunch break every single day. Sometimes she read to him. Sometimes she showed him videos on her phone, a small cracked device that looked like it was held together by hope and tape. Sometimes she just talked to him, telling him about her day, about school, about her dreams. I want to be a doctor when I grow up, she told Ethan one afternoon. Richard was standing in the hallway, just out of sight, listening. Not just any doctor. I want to help kids like you. Kids who need extra care. Because I think sometimes people forget that you understand everything. They talk about you like you're not in the room. But I know you're listening. I know you're smart. Smarter than most people. Probably. Ethan made a happy sound, and Sophia laughed. See? You agree with me. You're definitely smarter than most people. On the 4th day, Richard saw something that nearly broke him. It was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to set. Sophia had finished her homework early, and she had gone to Ethan's room with a small plastic bag. Richard followed her quietly, staying hidden behind the doorway. Okay, I have a surprise for you, Sophia announced. She pulled out a small bottle of nail polish from the bag. It was bright blue, the kind that cost maybe $2 at a drugstore. I saw this and I thought of you. Blue is your favorite color, right? You always look at blue things the longest. Ethan's eyes lit up. I'm going to paint your nails, Sophia said matter-of-factly. Boys can have painted nails too. Anyone who says they can is wrong. And besides, you're going to look so cool. She carefully took Ethan's hand in hers and began painting his nails with slow, gentle strokes. She was so focused, so careful, treating his hand like it was precious. My mom says that people like you are special, Sophia said softly as she worked. She says God gives some people extra challenges because he knows they're strong enough to handle them. I don't know if that's true, but I do know one thing. You're not broken, Ethan. You're perfect exactly the way you are. And anyone who doesn't see that is just not looking hard enough. Richard turned away from the door. He walked quickly down the hallway into his study and closed the door behind him. And for the first time since his wife's funeral, he wept for all the time he had lost, for all the moments he had missed, for all the days he had let fear and grief keep him away from his own son. He wept because a 12-year-old girl with nothing had given Ethan more love and attention in a few months than he had given him in 3 years. When the tears finally stopped, Richard sat at his desk and opened his laptop. He typed Sophia's name into a search engine, then made a few phone calls to people who owed him favors. Within an hour, he had her school records, straight A's every single year. Despite changing schools 3 times because of her mother's work situations, despite living in neighborhoods that were far from safe, despite everything working against her, Sophia Santos was one of the top students in her class. Her teachers had written notes about her. Exceptionally gifted, remarkable empathy for her age, a natural leader, shows great promise. She had earned a scholarship to a private school across town. A good school, one that could actually prepare her for college. But the scholarship only covered tuition. Maria still had to pay for uniforms, books, and transportation. Richard could only imagine how hard that must be on a housekeeper's salary. He dug deeper. He found out that Maria and Sophia lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in a rough part of the city. The building had failed several safety inspections. The roof leaked when it rained. This remarkable girl who dreamed of becoming a doctor, who took care of his son out of pure kindness, who had a heart bigger than anyone Richard had ever met, was living in conditions that were barely acceptable, and she never complained. She never asked for anything. She just showed up every day with a smile on her face and love in her heart. Richard closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. He had spent his entire career solving problems, building systems, creating solutions. He had made billions of dollars by seeing opportunities that others missed. Now, for the first time, he saw an opportunity that had nothing to do with money. He saw a chance to make things right. The question was, where should he even begin? Richard stared out the window at the fading sunset. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He was done being a stranger in his son's life. And he was done letting kindness go unreward. It was time to do something. Something big. He just needed to figure out exactly what that something was. The next morning, Richard woke up with a new sense of purpose. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't feel the heavy weight of grief pressing down on his chest the moment he opened his eyes. Instead, he felt something else. Something he had almost forgotten. He showered, dressed, and went downstairs earlier than usual. The cook was surprised to see him in the kitchen. "Mr. Harrington," she said, nearly dropping a pan. "Can I get you something? Your usual coffee?" "Yes, thank you," Richard said. Then he paused. "Actually, Make it 2 cups. And some of those pastries my son likes." The cook stared at him for a moment, clearly confused. In all the time she had worked here, Richard had never once asked for food to share with Ethan. But she recovered quickly and nodded. "Of course, sir. Right away." Richard took the tray himself and walked to his son's room. His hands were shaking slightly. It was ridiculous, really. This was his own child. He shouldn't feel nervous about visiting his own child. But he did, because somewhere along the way, he had let the distance between them grow so wide that now it felt like crossing an ocean dot. He pushed open the door gently. Ethan was already awake, propped up in his bed, looking out the window at the birds in the garden. When he heard the door, he turned his head. His eyes went wide when he saw who it was. "Good morning, son," Richard said softly. He walked over and sat down in the chair next to the bed. The same chair Sophia always sat in. "I brought you some breakfast. Your favorite pastries." Ethan stared at his father like he was seeing a ghost. Richard couldn't blame him. When was the last time he had done something like this? He couldn't even remember. "I know I haven't been around much," Richard said, his voice thick. "And I'm sorry for that." "I'm so sorry, Ethan, but I'm going to do better. I promise you. Starting today." Ethan made a sound. It was soft, but Richard understood it. He understood it perfectly. It meant okay. Richard spent the whole morning with his son. He fed him breakfast, piece by piece, the way he had watched Sophia do it. He wasn't as good at making silly voices or funny faces, but he tried. And every time Ethan smiled, even just a little, Richard felt his heart grow lighter. Around noon, there was a soft knock on the door. Richard looked up and saw Sophia standing in the doorway, holding her library book. She froze when she saw him there. "Oh," she said quickly, taking a step back. "I'm sorry. I didn't know you were here." "I'll go." "Wait," Richard said. "Please, come in." Sophia hesitated. She looked nervous, like she wasn't sure if she was in trouble. But after a moment, she stepped into the room. "I was just going to read to him," she said quietly. "But I can come back later." "Or not at all." "Whatever you want, Mr. Harrington." Richard shook his head. "No, please, stay. I'd like to hear this story too." He stood up and gestured to the chair. "You sit here. I'll sit over there." Sophia looked at him with surprise, but she didn't argue. She walked over to the chair and sat down, opening her book to where she had left off. Richard moved to a chair in the corner of the room, trying to make himself invisible. "Okay, Ethan," Sophia said, her voice warming up as she focused on the boy. "Where were we?" "Oh, right. The knight just discovered that the dragon wasn't evil at all. He was just protecting something. Remember?" She began to read, and Richard watched in amazement. The nervousness she had shown moments ago disappeared completely. She transformed into a storyteller, her voice painting pictures in the air. She did different voices for different characters. She paused at all the right moments to build suspense. She made Ethan laugh with silly sound effects. But what struck Richard most was how she talked to Ethan between the chapters. She asked him questions. She waited for his responses, even though those responses weren't words. She treated him like an equal, like someone whose opinion mattered. "What do you think is going to happen next?" She asked at one point. "Do you think the knight will help the dragon?" Ethan made an excited sound and moved his hand slightly. "Me too," Sophia said, grinning. "I think they're going to become best friends. Just like us." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. Just like us. This girl truly considered his son her best friend. It wasn't just something she said. She meant it. After the story was finished, Sophia said goodbye to Ethan and headed for the door. Richard followed her out into the hallway. "Sophia, wait." She stopped and turned around, her eyes worried. "Yes, Mr. Harrington?" Richard studied her for a moment. She was so small, so young, and yet there was something old in her eyes, something wise. This was a girl who had seen hard times, who had struggled, who knew what it meant to go without. But none of that had made her bitter. If anything, it had made her kinder. "Thank you," Richard said simply, "for being so good to my son." Sophia's expression softened. "You don't have to thank me. Ethan is special. He's the best listener I know, and he never judges me. Even when I mess up a word in the story or do a silly voice wrong, he just laughs and makes me feel like it's okay." "He does that, doesn't he?" Richard said quietly. "He does," Sophia agreed. "Your son has a big heart, Mr. Harrington. Bigger than most people. He just needs people to see it." She gave him a small smile and walked away. Heading back to the kitchen where her mother was working, Richard stood alone in the hallway for a long time, thinking. That afternoon, he made a phone call to his lawyer. Then he made another call to his accountant. Then he made a third call to a real estate agent he trusted. "I need you to find me a house," he told the agent. "Something small but nice, in a good neighborhood, good schools nearby, and it needs to be close to my estate. Within 15 minutes. What's your budget?" The agent asked. "There is no budget," Richard said. "Just find me the right house." He spent the rest of the day planning. He wrote lists. He made calculations. He thought about every detail, every possible obstacle, every way this could go wrong. He wanted to do something big for Sophia and her mother, but he had to do it right. He had seen too many cases where wealthy people tried to help and ended up making things worse because they didn't think it through. He didn't want to give them charity. He didn't want them to feel like they owed him something. He wanted to give them opportunity, a real chance at a better life. And he wanted to give his son something too. He wanted to give Ethan a real friend. Someone who would be there for him not because they were paid, but because they genuinely cared. That night, Richard went to his son's room to say goodnight. It was the first time he had done that in years. Ethan was already half asleep, but when he saw his father standing by the bed, his eyes flickered open. "I'm going to fix things," Richard whispered, gently touching his son's hair. "I don't know if you can understand me, but I need you to know that. I'm going to be a better father, and I'm going to make sure the people who love you are taken care of, no matter what it takes." Ethan made a small sound and closed his eyes. Within seconds, he was asleep. Richard stood there watching him for a long time. He thought about his wife and what she would say if she could see all of this. She would probably be angry at him for staying away so long, but she would also be proud of him for finally waking up. Better late than never, she would have said. "Now stop feeling sorry for yourself and do something about it." Richard smiled. The first real smile he had smiled in a very long time. Tomorrow, he would talk to Sophia and Maria. Tomorrow, he would put his plan into action. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, he just wanted to stand here and watch his son sleep. Tonight, he just wanted to be a father again. He had wasted 3 years. He wasn't going to waste another day. The next morning came faster than Richard expected. He had barely slept, but he didn't feel tired. His mind was racing with everything he wanted to say, everything he wanted to do. He had spent half the night rehearsing the conversation in his head, trying to find the right words. But now that the moment was here, he realized there were no perfect words. He just had to speak from the heart and hope that was enough. He waited until mid-morning, after Maria had finished her first round of cleaning and Sophia had settled into her usual corner in the kitchen with her homework. Then he took a deep breath and walked downstairs. Maria was polishing the dining room table when Richard approached her. She looked up and immediately straightened, the way she always did when he was around. "Mr. Harrington," she said, "is everything all right? Is there something you need?" Yes, Richard said. I need you and Sophia to come to my study. There's something important I want to discuss with both of you. Maria's face went pale. Her hands tightened around the polishing cloth. Richard could see the fear in her eyes, and he understood why. When the boss calls you into his office, it usually means bad news. Of course, Maria said quietly. I'll get Sophia right away. A few minutes later, Maria and Sophia stood in front of Richard's desk. Maria had her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her knuckles white. Sophia stood close to her mother, looking small and scared. She was clutching the strap of her backpack like it was a lifeline. Richard felt terrible. He hadn't meant to frighten them, but he didn't know how else to do this. Please, sit down, he said, gesturing to the two chairs across from his desk. They sat, but neither of them relaxed. Maria perched on the edge of her seat, like she was ready to run. Sophia kept glancing at her mother, trying to read the situation. Richard leaned forward and looked at Sophia. I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Can you do that? Sophia nodded slowly, her eyes wide. Why do you spend time with my son? The question hung in the air. Sophia blinked, surprised. She had probably expected something else. An accusation, maybe. A punishment. But not this. I don't understand, she said carefully. Did I do something wrong? No, Richard said. You didn't do anything wrong. I just want to understand. Nobody asked you to take care of Ethan. Nobody pays you to sit with him or read to him or feed him. So why do you do it? Sophia was quiet for a moment. She looked down at her hands, thinking. When she looked up again, her eyes were clear and steady. Because he's lonely, she said simply. I see how people act around him. The nurses do their jobs and then leave. The therapists come for an hour and then go home. Everyone treats him like he's a patient. Like he's a problem that needs to be managed. But he's not a problem. He's a person. He's a really good person. Richard felt those words hit him like a punch to the chest. A problem to be managed. That was exactly how he had treated his own son for the past 3 years. He had hired people to handle Ethan so that he wouldn't have to face the pain of being around him. Go on, Richard said quietly. Sophia took a breath. The first time I went to his room, it was an accident. I got lost looking for the bathroom. His door was open, and I saw him sitting there alone, staring out the window. He looked so sad. So I went in and said hello. And he smiled at me. This big, beautiful smile. Like nobody had just said hello to him in a really long time. Maria reached over and took her daughter's hand, squeezing it gently. After that, I started visiting him whenever I could, Sophia continued. I would tell him about my day, about school, about the books I was reading. And he listened. He really listened. Most people don't listen like that. They're always thinking about what they're going to say next. But Ethan just listens. He makes you feel like what you're saying matters. Richard nodded slowly. He knew exactly what she meant. His wife used to say the same thing about Ethan. He has his father's eyes, but his mother's heart. She would say, he feels everything deeply. And the reading? Richard asked. The feeding? The nail polish? Sophia's cheeks turned a little pink. I just wanted him to have fun. I wanted him to feel like a normal kid. Everyone deserves to feel special sometimes. Everyone deserves to have someone make silly voices for him and paint their nails and tell them stories about dragons and knights. She paused, then added quietly, my mom always says you don't need to be asked to be kind. You just do it because it's right. Richard looked at Maria, who had tears streaming down her face. She was crying silently, not wanting to interrupt. Your mother is a wise woman, Richard said. He stood up and walked around the desk. Both Maria and Sophia tensed, unsure of what was coming. Richard pulled a chair over and sat down in front of them, so they were all at the same level. "I owe you both an apology," he said. "Maria, you have worked in this house for 2 years. You have never once complained, never once asked for special treatment. And I never even bothered to learn anything about you or your daughter. I treated you like you were invisible. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." Maria shook her head, wiping her tears. "Mr. Harrington, you don't have to apologize. You're my employer. I never expected." "That's exactly the problem," Richard interrupted gently. "I should have seen you, both of you, but I was too wrapped up in my own grief to notice anything else." He turned to Sophia. "And you? You came into my home and gave my son something that money can't buy. You gave him friendship. Real friendship. You made him laugh. You made him feel seen. You did what I should have been doing all along." Sophia didn't know what to say. She just stared at him, her young face full of confusion and hope. "Do you know what I do for a living, Sophia?" Richard asked. "You make computers or something," she said. "That's what Mom told me." Richard smiled. "Something like that. I build things. I solve problems. I take complicated situations and figure out how to make them better. And right now, I'm looking at a situation I want to solve." "What situation?" Sophia asked. "You dream of becoming a doctor," Richard said. "I know because you told Ethan. You said you want to help kids like him. Kids who need extra care. Kids who are sometimes forgotten." He paused. "That's a beautiful dream. And I want to help make it happen." Sophia's eyes went wide. Maria gasped softly. "I don't understand," Sophia whispered. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. He handed it to Sophia. It was a business card with the name of a lawyer and a phone number. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to set up something called an educational trust," Richard explained. "It's a special fund that will pay for your schooling. All of it. Private school, college, medical school. Books, supplies, everything. You won't have to worry about money. You can just focus on learning and becoming the doctor you're meant to be." Sophia stared at the card in her hands. Her fingers were trembling. "But that's not all," Richard continued. He looked at Maria. "I've also found a house for you and your daughter. It's small, but it's in a good neighborhood. Safe streets. Good schools nearby. And it's already paid for. No mortgage, no mortgage. It's yours." Maria's hand flew to her mouth. She couldn't speak. Tears were pouring down her face now. "Why?" Sophia finally managed to say. "Why would you do all this for us?" Richard looked at this remarkable girl, this 12-year-old who had taught him more about love and kindness than anyone else in years. He thought about how to answer a question. "Because you showed me something I forgot," he said. "You showed me that my son isn't broken. You showed me that he just needs people who see him for who he really is. You gave him your time and your heart when you had every reason to keep those things for yourself." He paused, his voice growing thick. "And because good people deserve good things. Sophia, the world doesn't always work that way. But when I have the power to make it work that way, I should use it." Sophia looked at her mother, then back at Richard. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Sophia did something unexpected. She stood up, walked over to Richard, and hugged him. Richard froze. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had hugged him. But after a second, he hugged her back. "Thank you," Sophia whispered. And for the first time in a very long time, Richard felt like maybe, just maybe, he was finally doing something right. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Maria and Sophia had ever experienced. True to his word, Richard set everything in motion. The lawyers drew up the paperwork for the educational trust. The real estate agent finalized the house. And within a month, Maria and Sophia moved out of their cramped, leaky apartment and into a cozy 3-bedroom home. Just 10 minutes from the Harrington estate. The first night in their new house, Sophia walked from room to room in complete disbelief. She had her own bedroom, her own desk, her own closet that didn't smell like mold. She stood in the middle of her new room and spun around slowly, taking it all in. "Mom," she called out. "Mom, come look at this." Maria appeared in the doorway, still wearing her coat because she hadn't quite accepted that this was real yet. "There's a window seat," Sophia said, pointing. "I've always wanted a window seat. I can sit here and read and watch the birds outside." Maria walked over and sat down on the window seat next to her daughter. She pulled Sophia close and held her tight. "I don't know what we did to deserve this," Maria whispered. Sophia leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. "You always told me that kindness comes back around. Maybe it just took a little while. But the house and the trust fund weren't the only things that changed. Richard had one more surprise. He offered Sophia an official position as Ethan's companion. It was a real job with a real salary, and it worked around her school schedule. Sophia would spend a few hours each day with Ethan, doing exactly what she had always done. Reading to him, talking to him, being his friend. Only now she was being recognized for it. "You don't have to pay me," Sophia had told Richard when he first offered. "I would do it for free. I love spending time with Ethan." "I know you would," Richard said. "That's exactly why you deserve to be paid. The people who do things out of love are the ones who should be valued the most." Sophia thought about that for a long time. She realized he was right. Her mother had spent years working hard and being kind, never expecting anything in return. And look what had happened. Sometimes the world did reward good people. You just had to be patient. As the months passed, something else began to change too. Something even more important than houses and trust funds. Richard became a father again. He started spending real time with Ethan, not just a few minutes here and there, but hours every day. He learned how to feed his son the way Sophia did, with silly voices and funny stories. He learned which books Ethan liked best and which movies made him laugh. He learned the sounds Ethan made and what each one meant. It wasn't easy. There were days when Richard felt overwhelmed by guilt for all the time he had lost. There were nights when he sat alone in his study, wondering if he could ever make up for 3 years of absence. But he kept trying. Every single day, he kept trying. And slowly, the wall between father and son began to crumble. One evening, about 6 months after everything had changed, Richard was sitting in Ethan's room reading him a story. It was the same dragon book that Sophia had been reading when Richard first started paying attention. They had finished it twice already, but Ethan never got tired of it. Richard closed the book and looked at his son. Ethan's eyes were heavy with sleep, but he was fighting to stay awake. "You know," Richard said softly, "I wasted a lot of time being scared. I was scared that I couldn't be a good father to you. I was scared that every time I looked at you, I would think about your mother and it would hurt too much. So I stayed away. And that was the biggest mistake of my life." Ethan made a small sound. His hand moved slightly on the blanket. Richard took his son's hand and held it gently. "But I'm not scared anymore, because I finally understand something. Your mother isn't gone. She's right here in you. Every time you smile, I see her smile. Every time you laugh, I hear her laugh. You're the best part of both of us, Ethan, and I'm never going to forget that again." Ethan's fingers curled around his father's hand. It was a small movement, but it meant everything. Richard stayed there until his son fell asleep. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel sad when he thought about his wife. He felt grateful. Grateful for the time they had together. Grateful for the son she had given him. And grateful for a 12-year-old girl who had shown him how to love again. 10 years passed. A lot can change in 10 years. Buildings rise and fall. People come and go. The world keeps spinning, and life moves forward whether we're ready or not. But some things stay the same. On a warm spring afternoon, a young woman walked across a stage at one of the best medical schools in the country. She was wearing a cap and gown, and she was trying very hard not to cry. Sophia Santos had done it. Against all odds, she had become a Dr. Dot in the audience. Maria sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face. She had watched her daughter work so hard for so many years. The late nights studying, the early mornings at the hospital, the moments of doubt and exhaustion when Sophia wondered if she could really make it. But she had made it. She had really made it. Sitting next to Maria was Richard Harrington. He looked older now, with gray hair at his temples and lines around his eyes. But he was smiling, really smiling, the way he had learned to smile again all those years ago. And next to Richard, in a wheelchair that had been specially designed for comfort, was Ethan. He was 18 now, a young man with his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn determination. He couldn't clap like the others in the audience, but he made a sound of pure joy when Sophia's name was called. A sound that carried across the auditorium and made Sophia look up, searching for him in the crowd. When she found him, she smiled and waved. He was still her best friend. After all these years that had never changed. After the ceremony, the four of them gathered outside for photos. Maria and Sophia, Richard and Ethan, two families that had become one. "I can't believe this is real," Sophia said, looking at her diploma. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and be back in that old apartment, doing homework in the corner of a kitchen." Richard put a hand on her shoulder. "You earned this, Sophia. Every bit of it. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Sophia looked at him, this man who had changed her life so completely. "I made you a promise once," she said. "Do you remember?" Richard nodded. He remembered everything about that day in his study. "You asked me to never stop seeing the invisible ones," Sophia said. "The people who get overlooked. The people who need someone to notice them." She paused. "I'm starting my residency next month. Pediatric neurology. I'm going to spend my career helping kids like Ethan. Kids who deserve to be seen." Richard felt his eyes sting with tears. He looked at his son, who was watching Sophia with so much pride and love. "You kept your promise," Richard said quietly. Sophia smiled. "You kept yours too." She was right. He had promised to be a better father, and he had spent every day since trying to live up to that promise. He wasn't perfect. Nobody was. But he was present. He was there for his son in all the ways that mattered. That evening, the four of them went out to dinner together. They laughed and told stories and celebrated everything they had been through. At one point, Richard looked around the table at these three people who had become his family. And he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt complete. Years ago, he had thought that money could fix anything. He had thought that success was measured in dollars and deals and quarterly reports. But he had been wrong. So completely wrong. The real measure of success was sitting right in front of him. A son who knew he was loved. A friend who had become family. And a young woman who had taught him that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. Richard raised his glass. "To second chances," he said. Maria raised hers. "To never giving up." Sophia raised hers and looked at Ethan. "To best friends." Ethan made his sound of joy. The one that meant happiness, the one that meant love. And that, Richard thought, was the only answer that mattered.